You know that white crystal you stir into your coffee? The sweetness in pretty much every snack we eat? It's one of the most common things on the planet. But it has this secret history, one that's not written in cookbooks, but in blood and bondage. This is the story of how our collective sweet tooth didn't just build empires, it unleashed an absolute nightmare. It's kind of hard to wrap your head around, but 500 years ago, sugar wasn't some cheap thing you buy in a giant bag. Oh no, it was an exotic luxury, a symbol of immense power and status. Only kings and queens could get their hands on it. It was used as medicine, as a potent spice, and they even sculpted it into these incredible statues for royal feasts. Seriously, it was literally more valuable than gold. But here's the thing. To get that incredible sweetness onto the banquet tables of Europe, a global machine had to be built. And the fuel for that machine? It was human lives. So that really brings us to the core question we're going to explore. What was the true hidden price of all that sweetness? To really get how sugar became this global monster, we've got to go back. We need to trace its incredible journey out of the ancient world. Because long before it ever crossed the Atlantic, it was already shaping entire civilizations. So sugar's journey is just incredibly long. It all starts in New Guinea, where people just chewed on the raw stalk. But the real game changer happens in India, where they figure out how to crystallize it into a powder. And that technology, that's what starts to travel. First to Persia, then it spreads all through the Arab trade networks into the Mediterranean. So by the time it finally lands in Europe in the 15th century, its reputation as this rare, precious, almost magical substance is already thousands of years old. Okay, and this is where the story takes a really dark turn. Europe's growing obsession with sugar created a huge problem. They needed way more land and way more labor than they could possibly get their hands on. The solution they came up with? Well, it would change the world forever. Look, this wasn't just about farming. This was something totally new. To feed this growing addiction on an industrial scale, they invented what we now call the plantation complex. And you have to understand, it was an agro-industrial machine designed for one thing and one thing only, to churn out maximum profit no matter the human cost. So yeah, the plantation complex, it wasn't a family farm. Think of it more like a factory that happens to be in a field. It was this deadly formula perfected for ruthless efficiency that combined huge areas of land, a total focus on one single crop, and it was all powered by the most brutal form of labor imaginable. So the whole thing really stood on three pillars, and you need all three for it to work. First, you've got latifundio. That just means these massive estates all controlled by a single owner. Second, monoculture. They only grew sugar, nothing else. Which means, of course, they couldn't even grow food to feed themselves. And that leads directly to the third, absolutely essential pillar, a constant, systematic, unending supply of enslaved people from Africa to do the horrific work. You take away any one of those pillars, and the whole system just collapses. Now, this whole plantation machine needed fuel, and its fuel was a powerful and deeply twisted economic engine, an engine that locked three continents, Europe, Africa, and the Americas, into this violent, self-perpetuating, and wildly profitable cycle of trade and suffering. And this table just lays it all out clear as day. This is how it worked. First leg, ships leave Europe loaded with manufactured goods and, importantly, cheap rum, and they head to West Africa. Second leg, the horrific Middle Passage. They trade those goods for enslaved human beings who were then packed into ships and taken across the Atlantic. Then the third leg, the survivors are forced to work on the plantations producing sugar, which is then shipped back to Europe. The profits from that sugar fund the very next voyage. It's a perfect, vicious circle. And if you want to understand just how completely people were turned into commodities in this system, just look at this. The price of a human being wasn't paid in gold. It was paid in cheap rum, a literal byproduct of the sugar production itself, somewhere between 110 and 130 gallons. The system was literally feeding itself on its own bitter harvest. The human cost of that second leg of the triangle, it's almost impossible for us to really comprehend. But we have firsthand accounts. Oladada Equiano, who actually survived that journey, wrote about the hold of a slave ship. He described the filth, the sickness, the constant crying, the suffocating despair that was the reality for millions of people. Now, it is so important to get this next part. This brutal system, the one perfected in the Caribbean sugar islands, it didn't stay there. It was exported. it became the direct operational model, the economic and legal blueprint for the system of slavery that would come to define the American South. Here it is. This is the smoking gun. On the left, the Barbados Slave Code from 1661. This is the law that literally defined people as property. And on the right, the South Carolina Slave Code from a few decades later. And it wasn't just inspired by the Barbados model. No, it was a direct copy-paste job, often using the exact same brutal language to write racial slavery into law on the American mainland. And the connection gets even more direct. In Saint-Domingue, which was the world's most profitable sugar colony, the enslaved people rose up and they won their freedom. This sent massive shockwaves through the global economy. All of a sudden, the world's biggest sugar producer was gone, creating this huge economic void. So Southern planters in America rushed to fill it, but not with sugar, with cotton. This single pivot, directly caused by the collapse of a sugar colony, led to a violent, massive expansion of the American cotton kingdom and a huge intensification of slavery right here in the United States. Now, you might think the story kind of ends there with the abolition of slavery, but it doesn't, not even close. The logic of the plantation system, that ruthless efficiency, it didn't just disappear, it evolved. It moved from the cane field into our modern food system, and it created a whole new kind of crisis. And all you have to do is look at the consumption numbers to see the shift. In just 100 years, the amount of sugar the average person in England was eating just exploded. It went from a super rare luxury, 4 pounds a year, to a daily staple at 20 pounds a year. It became the cheap fuel for the new industrial working class. Sugar was everywhere, but that industrial logic was still there. Right. So the same industrial mindset that squeezed every last drop of profit out of a sugar mill was just applied to modern food science. The goal was exactly the same: create the most profitable product possible, regardless of what it does to people. And that's when sugar was completely transformed. It was no longer just a commodity. It became a kind of weaponized ingredient. It was the cheapest, easiest way to make processed foods taste better, last longer on the shelf, and, this is the critical part, make you want to eat more of it. And that, right there, set the stage for the modern epidemics of obesity, diabetes, and heart disease. And this is where the story comes full circle, in the most bitter, ironic way imaginable. The very same low-income communities and communities of color, many of whom are the descendants of the people exploited by the sugar trade, are now the primary targets for the marketing of these same sugar-filled products. They are the ones who suffer the most from the health crises that modern sugar helps create. So when you trace that line, all the way from the cane field to the slave ship, from the plantation to the factory, and then right into the supermarket aisle, you realize it's a single, unbroken chain. So what does that mean? What's the final takeaway from this brutal legacy? It means this: the story of sugar really is the story of our modern world. And the next time you taste something sweet, you have to remember, you're not just consuming a sweetener. You are consuming the complex and bitter legacy of power, exploitation, and profit that came with it.